One of the big storylines from the recent UCP convention in Calgary was the Take Back Alberta crowd. Now, it's a little more conservative compared to the mainstream aspects of the party, but it is now control over the UCP board. Now, to chat about this in more detail is our legislative reporter and the Alberta correspondent for the National Post, Tyler Dawson, who joins us once again from Edmonton. Tyler, how much power does the board actually have when it comes to the party?
Well, that's the thing. The board doesn't actually have a lot of power. Now, I think there's a lot of people out there who are talking about this and thinking about this in terms of the idea that there's now this board that's going to have control over Premier Danielle Smith and what she does. And that's not really how it works. The board does have a lot of power. You know, they manage fundraising and candidate nominations, and they also, sort of help schedule and run leadership reviews and things like that. But, they're not involved really in the day-to-day policymaking or operations of government. So, I think there's maybe, in some ways, perhaps going to be a little bit of disappointment from some of the people who are all fired up about the new board. And there might be a little bit of surprise from people who are concerned about it when they sort of see whether or not they have any impact on what the government's doing. So, it's not as, as all powerful, I think, as people are sort of making it out to be. But they certainly do have enough power, I would say, to cause Premier Danielle Smith some problems if they really want to.
As for the UCP's annual general meeting itself, Tyler, almost all of the policy proposals passed. What were some of the bigger ones in your opinion?
Well, the one that didn't pass, interestingly, was about school vouchers, but it was sort of a modification of a prior policy, so maybe not that massive of a news item. Certainly, the ones that I think are going to be headline grabbers and the ones that are going to be challenging policy discussions for the government is the pronoun policy in schools, similar to what Saskatchewan and New Brunswick are doing. Whether that's something that Premier Danielle Smith chooses to adopt remains to be seen. What that debate is going to look like in the legislature remains to be seen. There are a bunch of sort of medical adjacent ones that are going to get a lot of attention, I think, certainly in quarters that are still concerned about the way the pandemic unfolded. A couple of them around vaccine exemptions, but also using off-brand medication. There's a few free speech ones, for example, whether or not professional bodies like College of Psychologists, for example, should be able to regulate sort of off-the-job conduct on behalf of members, that if that becomes government policy is going to get a lot of attention. And I think some of the education ones more broadly, one of the ones that really jumped out at me was a policy that would have books that have sort of sexual or racist or violent themes removed from school libraries, which will, there's the possibility, that we have a debate about whether or not To Kill a Mockingbird should be in school libraries in a couple months. So, if that becomes government policy, I think that's going to be one that a lot of people will be paying attention to. So, and then I should also just shout out to the fact that, there were some like steady as she goes standard conservative policy things discussed, whether that was the inheritance taxes and things like that on family farms, the support for transportation, utility, and industrial corridors between various jurisdictions. So it's not all just sort of some of these culture war, socially conservative policies, but certainly I think those are the ones that people paid the most attention to and will get the most attention if they come up in the legislature.
A topic of discussion which has been dominating headlines across Canada is Alberta potentially pulling out of the CPP, going on its own with an APP. Our province's finance minister, Nate Horner, met with other provincial finance ministers last week to talk about an Alberta-made pension plan and what it would actually mean. What were some of the main takeaways from that meeting, Tyler?
Well, probably the big takeaway is that Chrystia Freeland, the federal finance minister, has asked the chief actuary of Canada to do their own math. When that report came out a few weeks ago, or maybe a couple months ago, and time is flying at the moment, it basically said Alberta was entitled to $334 billion of the CPP's total assets, which is about 53%. And that's obviously a number that the other finance ministers are concerned about. They don't want, half the CPP to walk away because that would have consequences for workers and retirees in their jurisdiction. So whatever estimate the federal government comes back with, I think is going to be, sort of the bombshell that lands. Is it substantially less than what the Alberta government thinks we're entitled to? Is it for some reason the same? That's I think really going to define the conversation going forward. And I think the other thing that came out of it is probably something that most people hadn't really thought of, and that was this idea of international pension agreements. So, if you retire somewhere else in the world, how do you get your pension? Is it administered through a national pension plan in another country? The Canadian government has, I think, more than 100 separate agreements
Right.
with other countries. The Quebec pension plan, which is already separate, I think has about 80 or 60 agreements. So just some stuff that I think people hadn't maybe thought all that much about that just sort of adds to the complexity of this issue beyond just the dollar figure, beyond what it might mean for Alberta. So I think those were sort of the two big takeaways. And then the third one that probably merits mentioning is just that this is kind of Alberta against everybody else. I don't think there's been a single premier who has come out in favor of Alberta leaving the pension plan, other than obviously Danielle Smith, and Justin Trudeau and Pierre Poilievre both basically opposed to it. So the dynamic here is really, really interesting. This isn't like the carbon tax, for example, where we've had allies in other parts of the country.
And you know what's interesting too is the fact that Daniel Smith has said that there'll be more studying done and a referendum will actually be held to see if Albertans want to physically pull out of the CPP. And that is concerning, you're right, especially if Albertans want to retire in places which may potentially be more affordable, like Mexico, maybe a small town or a small village in Italy, where your money goes a lot further. Retirees are potentially looking outside of the box and outside of Canada. Tyler, the legislature is back in session and the UCP is legislating at record speed. They're currently around, 6 bills before politicians right now, including Bill 1, which would require Alberta to hold a referendum on tax increases.
That's right. So this is sort of a policy that California has actually had for a long time, but the basic principle is relatively simple. If there's going to be an increase to the income tax or a sales tax, whether that's corporate or personal, it would need to go to a referendum for Albertans. And so the thing that's sort of interesting about this is obviously there's the conservative ideology behind it of not wanting to increase taxes, but it also is interesting because if there comes a time when something like a sales tax is necessary, say resource revenues are cratered, it becomes quite difficult for the government to raise taxes, which is obviously the purpose of this. It makes it much more difficult for the government to raise taxes. But it'll be interesting, I guess, if we end up in a situation where all of a sudden revenues are in trouble and tax increases are needed. But of course, no one wants to pay more taxes, so the government could find itself in a little bit of a bind. But certainly, it's a sign, a symbol, a symbolic step that this government does not want to raise taxes on Albertans.
Some sad news here as well, Tyler. New stats are out and Alberta's on pace to have its worst year ever for opioid deaths. Now, there are around 200 more deaths at this point than there were at the same time last year. What's the province doing about it?
Yeah, so the province is still really pushing forward on its recovery-oriented method of tackling addictions. So that looks like new recovery centers, that looks like hiring staff to work in these places, things like that. Now, of course, there's a lag time on all of that. You can't, dream up a new recovery center overnight. There's construction and hiring and all of those things. I believe they have opened 2 of them around the province, maybe 3. So that is very much ongoing. What hasn't happened yet, which I think we are going to see in the next 6 months or so, is the Compassionate Intervention Act, which is the bit of legislation that they're contemplating that would allow a judge basically to force someone into opioid treatment. It's going to be super controversial policy. It's going to be challenged legally, almost certainly, but that hasn't come up yet. And the other thing that hasn't happened yet is at the UCP convention last weekend, one of the policies that was debated was whether or not the government should end provincial funding for supervised injection sites. And that policy passed. And so that's obviously what the party grassroots want to see happen. Whether that becomes government policy, government law, that very much remains to be seen. But if that does happen, it would likely end most of the supervised injection sites around the province. And that would be very, very controversial. As you say, about 200 more deaths this year. So I think it's around 1,300 people already this year compared to about 1,100 last year. So some very, very dire numbers. There's no doubt about that.
Let's talk a little bit more about healthcare here, Tyler. The province is about to overhaul Alberta Health Services. Leaked copies of the plan made its way into the hands of reporters. Now, Health Minister Adriana LaGrange says the document in question is actually old news. It's old, and neither she nor Premier Smith disputed its accuracy.
That's right. And so that came out on Tuesday, and then Wednesday morning they held a press conference basically announcing the changes, and it did hew rather largely to the leaked plan that came out on Tuesday afternoon. It's a big overhaul, and I think, at this point, people are still sort of trying to digest it and figure out what it means. But the Coles Notes version of it is that you're going to have 4 sort of separate agencies running healthcare in the province. You're going to have AHS is going to be responsible for hospitals and acute care. You're going to have a separate board for addictions and mental health, a separate board for continuing care, and a separate board for primary care. And so it's basically just rearranging Alberta Health Services into these 4 other bureaucracies to try and streamline or make more efficient the healthcare system. Now, the government was very, very cautious about saying that, look, there's not going to be job losses at the frontline level for doctors, nurses, things like that. It's going to roll out, I believe, over the next 18 months or so. There's going to be consultations and feedback and all that sort of stuff. But I think at this point, it's hard to say exactly what this is going to do. This is certainly reorganizing a lot of the sort of behind the scenes administrative bureaucratic parts of the way the health system runs. Bit harder to say maybe how this is going to change things when you go into your doctor's office, when you go into a hospital in 2 years' time, what that'll look like. So we'll see. I mean, this is not the first time Alberta's gone through big reorganizations of the healthcare system. So maybe it'll work this time.
Tyler, the province has also tabled a bill that will clarify who's in charge during an emergency like a pandemic. Can you explain?
This one's really, really interesting. So if people remember the Ingram decision, it was in regards to charges that had been laid under the Public Health Act for violations during the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, what the judge concluded in that case was that Alberta's Public Health Act basically said that these laws, these rules around the pandemic needed to be made by the chief medical officer of health, not the government or not cabinet. And of course, everyone sort of scratched their heads over that, saying, well, of course, decisions are left up to politicians. The medical officer of health gives advice and they go from there. But that wasn't the way the legislation was written. So a bit of a sort of administrative or legalistic mix-up, but that did necessitate this new bit of legislation that clarifies who's actually in charge. And so this new bit of legislation clarifies that, in fact, politicians are in charge and that the chief medical officer of health gives advice and politicians take that or they don't take it and they make rules. I think this was always the way it was going to go. I don't think any government, whether that's the UCP or the NDP, would want a chief medical officer of health, deciding policy during a pandemic. And I don't think Albertans would necessarily want that either, because who do you hold accountable if you don't like what's been done? So I find it very interesting philosophically, but I can't imagine this bill is going to be wildly controversial or that it's going to change anything. It just sort of clarifies that the way things were done during the pandemic was the way that everyone sort of thinks it should be done and thought it should have done. And they just got kind of hung up on this clause in the original bit of legislation.
Let's switch gears for just a moment here. Talk about all the wildfires our province saw this season, Tyler. Now, the wildfire season has officially come to an end. It was 10 times worse than in previous years. More than 38,000 Albertans were displaced due to blazes this year.
Yeah, and a couple dozen communities had to evacuate. So quite a bad fire season, as you say. In terms of the total hectares burned, about 10 times more than sort of the other recent years' trends that we've had. So really, really bad wildfire season. Ended October 31st, and it starts up again, I think, on March 1st. So the government is already planning ahead. I think we talked the last time about this proposal to maybe use AI to try and figure out where the hot spots are going to be and the next fires might start up. So certainly this government is anticipating there being another bad fire year. Hopefully it won't be as bad, but, preparing for the worst and hope for the best, I think, is sort of seems to be the theme right now in forest fire management.
We just recently had Premier Danielle Smith on Bridge City News. I had the honor of doing a 15-minute Q&A with her. But another journalist, former Fox News host Tucker Carlson, will be in Calgary in January to also have a conversation with Premier Smith. Any idea what they're going to chat about, Tyler?
That's a great question. I would imagine they're going to talk about some of the sort of cultural stuff that we've talked about. I imagine they're going to talk about some of the pandemic stuff. I think Tucker Carlson certainly leaned pretty hard into some of that. So he's going to be in Calgary, I think in January, and he's sort of giving a speech and then having a conversation with Smith. And this actually came up in the legislature with the NDP saying, look, Tucker Carlson got fired from Fox News. He's super controversial. Why is the Premier affiliating with him? That sort of thing. And the Premier said, look, I do interviews with journalists from all sorts of backgrounds, so of course I'm going to sit down and talk with Tucker Carlson. So whether one likes Tucker or not, I think every reporter is going to be watching that because it should be a bit of a spectacle in the dead of winter, I would say.
And apparently he has even more viewers since he moved his platform over to X from Fox News. The support from Elon Musk, so...
maybe there's a future for all of us in alternative media.
That's true. He's our legislative reporter and the Alberta correspondent with the National Post, Tyler Dawson. Thanks so much for joining us today from Edmonton.
Thanks so much, Hal.